So 8.0 has officially arrived and the Mage Towers are gone. But before we move on from that and we go into other types of content, I just wanted to make one quick last review of the Mage Tower system as a whole and what I really thought about it, which ones were good, which ones were bad, and where we can go moving forward, what we want from Blizzard when it comes to these solo challenges, because these are a fun little side thing to do in the game. I don't think it should ever be like the ultimate thing in the game. It should never be at the same level as like the group contents, like your Mythic Pluses that we saw out of this expansion, or especially raiding. But I definitely think it has its place. It's not something that if you don't do, you'll be behind other people who did do it. It's just a cosmetic reward that will give you something to feel good about doing and just kind of give you something else to do in the game that's fun. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive into what I kind of thought about the challenges as a whole. So just to start off, I have to say that I was really impressed that they came out with 7 different Mage Towers. When you really think about that, that's actually pretty cool because of the fact that when you look at the predecessors to this, especially in like Mists of Pandaria, where you had the Green Fire Quest for the Warlocks, and then there were the Proving Grounds also in Mists of Pandaria. Now there were 3 of those. There was one for tanks, healers, and DPS, but they were all the exact same with those 3 things in mind. With these Mage Towers, you had twice as many, more than twice as many, because there were 7, and they were all fairly unique in how you would deal with them from spec to spec. Not even just class to class, but from spec to spec. So you were approaching these challenges very differently, even if the overall idea was the same. And when you just, back up from the challenges for a second and look at it like that, it's pretty cool that we got this many different challenges. I thought that was pretty alright. But obviously it's not all amazingness and awesomeness. There was definitely a lot of cracks and not all the challenges were created equal. So we'll kind of start with that. We'll start at the bottom of the challenges with Fell Totem's Fall. Really, it was an interesting idea, but the problem with it was just that most of the mechanics tended to take care of themselves. If you stood in the middle of the room, the Yoremonger would just kind of run through all the rocks and break its armor on its own. The ads didn't have a lot of health. The totem only had 5 health, so you just blew on it and then it would die. And the things to dodge in this encounter were really easy. You had to dodge a Sonic Blast, which you saw the cast was happening, you'd stop casting, and the rocks on the ground that would just kind of show big swirlies and you'd have plenty of times to get out of them. So the only thing that was really impactful about this was Fell Burst, that you just interrupted or you CC'd him, and then that was it. It was definitely the easiest of the challenges by far for all the specs that had to deal with this one, but it was okay. There was nothing really wrong with it. It just wasn't as impactful. It wasn't as fun as the other challenges, so we'll leave that one there. But honestly, that was the only one that I had any real serious issues with. The rest of them were great, and all of them were pretty much fun in their own right, so just keep that in mind as we continue to work our way forward. The next challenge that we'll talk about is the End of the Risen Threat, which was the healing challenge for all of the healers except for the Discipline Priest. And the only real criticism that it's going to get from me is that it was just too long. When you compare it to the other challenges for the tanks and the DPS, you were never doing it for more than maybe like 8 minutes at max, maybe 10 if you were really pushing something on, like, say, Sigrun. But most of them were pretty short. Most of them were between 3 and 6 minutes. I'd say that'd be about the average. While the healing challenge was upwards of 20 minutes, especially if you weren't comfortable with it and you were really taking your time in between the different phases. So even if you were like really rushing your way through it, you're probably going to get to about 17 minutes, which just felt so incredibly long, and messing up towards the end felt so punishing. It was basically like trying to do the Proving Grounds back when you were trying to get like the titles for the Endless Wave 30, which was a commitment of 30 minutes every single time that you tried to go for that. That's kind of what it felt like, but it kept changing up the later you got in this one, instead of just kind of repeating the same 10 waves. So this was just like, it was fun. I really enjoyed it. I thought the first phase was really, really good. I would have preferred that to just be a little bit longer and that to be the entirety of the challenge. The gauntlet in the middle was honestly just wasting time. I don't think anyone really struggled with it once they kind of learned it. Like, I know the first time that I did it, I wiped on it because I didn't know what the balls did, the little balls of lightning, and I was just like, I'll just walk through this. What could possibly go wrong? And that was a mistake. But outside of that, like, first time, I don't think I ever wiped on it again with any other character or any other attempt for that matter. So it just felt like you were just, here's 5 minutes that you have to get through. Enjoy wasting your time until you get to the next part that's actually difficult. So the gauntlet was a little bit too much as well. Maybe if you just cut the gauntlet out of it and just maybe had the first part and the last part, that probably would have made it feel a lot better. But even just an elongated version of the first phase would have been totally fine, in my opinion. But other than that, it was still fun. It was just way too long. Moving on to Agatha the Impossible Foe. This was like the ad cleave fight for all of the challenges, and depending on the gear that you had when you did it, your experience with it could wildly change. Especially if you had like really low gear, this could either be really difficult or it could just mean that the challenge went on for a really long time, like upwards of like 10 minutes, as you were spending more times just fighting off the ads and getting a little bit of damage on Agatha. Whereas if you had more gear, you'd be wiping them clean really quickly and getting more uptime on Agatha. Now, gear wasn't the only thing that made this either easier or harder. Obviously, how you played your class made a big difference. For pretty much most of the classes, you would be using some sort of cooldown, either like a shorter cooldown like a Brutal Slash with the Feral Druids, or your artifact ability for like Enhancement Shaman. Saving those abilities specifically for the ads made this a lot easier, and the way that you were targeting made this a lot easier for like, especially for like Elemental Shaman, making sure it bounced to as many targets as possible with your Chain Lightning, and things like that. Just playing specifically to the challenge and saving certain abilities for certain parts of the fight really made a big difference. Overall, I think this was a really well-designed fight in general. Obviously, some classes had it a lot harder times, like Outlaw Rogues, but even for them, in my opinion, it wasn't really that bad comparatively to the other challenges. I didn't feel like it was that much harder or even necessarily harder. It was just different, and their AoE just works a little bit differently, so it feels harder. You can't just go around spamming one button with Blade Flurry active and hope for the best. You really just needed to be abusing the hell out of Marked for Death to get the most benefit out of it if you were at low item level. Moving on to Sigrun, which was the God Queen's Fury. This one felt all over the place in terms of balance. On one side you had Assassination Rogue, Enhancement Shaman, and Retribution Paladin, which were fairly easy in my opinion, and that kind of comes down to their ability to kind of self-sustain when it came to their healing. And then on the other side of things you had the Demonology Warlock and the Arcane Mage. So starting off with the easier ones, they just felt like they could kind of chop through it. There was a lot of mistakes that they could erase by being able to heal and recover that way. But then on the other side of things, I think Demonology was probably easier than I was making it out to be. But for me personally, having to learn that spec specifically to do this challenge probably made it a little bit harder for me than it probably should have been. But on the other hand, the Arcane Mage just straight up doesn't have any healing whatsoever, which means all that leeway that the other classes had, you don't have for the Arcane Mage. So back to the fight as a whole, I thought the mechanics were really well done. I thought it looked really nice for one. I thought they were fair. I know there was some overlap and some people really didn't like the fact that they overlapped, but you obviously could do it. You just had to be pre-planning what you were going to do before it actually happened. But the disparity in how hard this was, depending on what class you were playing on, was really, really weird. But other than that, I really enjoyed this fight. Moving on to Xylem, which was the Closing the Eye challenge. This one was interesting because most of the parts were fairly straightforward and simple, but did have that one intermission phase with all the mirror images that was usually the cause for concern for pretty much every single class that had this challenge. The rest of the fight, though, really wasn't that complicated. It was mainly just dodging mechanics and figuring out a way to handle certain things like the Razor Ice in a efficient way. The last phase with the corrupting shadows was fairly straightforward. You run away, you kill ads. If you didn't kill the ads in time, then you've pretty much wiped. But it was still straightforward on how you did it. You had to plan out exactly the abilities you were going to use, which was a little bit more important for certain classes like the subtlety rogue and the survival hunter. But for the most part, it mainly just came down to, can you reliably and efficiently get through the intermission stage without dying? So overall, I actually think this one was really good. It was just that I feel like there could have been a little bit more even distribution of the challenge. But overall, I think this one was pretty good. I enjoyed this one a lot too. I like the fact that different classes had different ways with handling certain mechanics. For instance, the heroic leap for warriors being really, really good for the intermission phase. The demon hunters being really good at everything when it came to this, jumping out of the ice, fell rushing through the intermission phase, and then also using fell rush to get distance between the corrupting shadows and yourself for the ads. A lot of classes had different ways to do this. Some of them had strengths, some of them had weaknesses, but they all had different ways to overcome the same challenge. So in that sense, when you're talking about building a challenge specifically for a set amount of classes, I thought this one did a really good job of doing that and balancing it in a way that allowed each specialization's unique talents and abilities to really shine, like I said, with the Fell Rush, or even like Survival Hunter's Harpoon and Flare. Flare for Hunters was really a big deal. That was the only way to get him out of his Shimmer. So yeah, things like that. I really like that they used multiple toolkits that all felt cool and unique while you were doing it for this challenge. Moving on to Raced and the Thwarting the Twins challenge. This one was really, really fun for me personally as someone who loves ranged classes and is maining a ranged, currently moving into BFA. This one was really fun because I just enjoy kiting. It's a fun, fairly skill-oriented thing to do in general just by itself, but then you're attaching an actual challenge on top of it, and that actually has real consequences if you don't do it appropriately. So I like the premise of this. Obviously, I think just about every single class that had this had some way to cheese it, where you could knock him back, you could knock Karam back so that he wouldn't go into his purgatory, which threw off the timing of the entire challenge, but that wasn't how it was meant. I thought that actually having to kite Karam around was actually really fun in general. Yes, it did cause some problems with some classes that especially needed to hard cast, like Frost Mage, but overall I found those to be really fun to try to maximize your DPS. I will say that things back again with Frost Mage, I found that one to be at least somewhat dependent on RNG. I don't want to just say it was completely dependent, but there was definitely some things there that you had to get somewhat lucky with crits and with procs. There's a couple layers of RNG layered on RNG. I get that. I understand that. But at the end of the day, if you were handling everything appropriately, you could still do fairly well in this challenge. Shadow Priest was another one that I really enjoyed. You did have to stop every now and then to hardcast your Vampiric Touch and your Mind Blast, but you did have a chance to get away from him with your slows that you could put on him with your Mind Flay and the tentacles that would spawn from that. Gave you those windows to get in those extra abilities. So the only one that really had the easiest time with, the easiest quote time with it was the Affliction Warlock, which didn't really ever have to stop and hardcast except for Unstable Affliction. So, but of course there you had to run a lot faster, again, unless you cheesed it. So all of these were really interesting takes on kiting. I think the weakest one of these was probably Balanced Druid, as he just ran super slow, but that was kind of an inevitability. He had to go that slow because Balanced Druids don't really have a way to slow him down. He might have been just running a bit too slow in my opinion. Probably the same thing with Marksman Hunter, just because Marksman Hunter can keep up the whatever it's called, the slowing shot. I forgot what it's called right now, but whatever. You can keep that up 100% of the time. So those two I thought were much easier than the other challenges that did it, but overall I really just enjoy the idea of having to kite, having multiple things that you're also having to avoid and deal with, and yeah, it was just really fun. The phasing was probably the only thing I didn't like, not being able to stay on race the entire time, but overall, pretty good fight. I enjoyed it. A little bit hard depending on your gearing with some of those, but overall, I definitely enjoyed this fight. And finally, with the last challenge, we have Cruel, the High Lord's Return. So this one was definitely my favorite. I think that's probably obvious if you go and look at my upload history. You'll see that I did all 6 of those before I touched any of the other Mage Towers as far as making videos for it. And it's just because I enjoyed it the most. And at the time for this expansion, for Legion, I was maining a tank, and I really wanted to make that my goal. That was my original goal with this channel, was just to do all the tanks and make it mainly just a tanking challenge, and it definitely bloomed into something more than that. But I thought that this challenge was just really well designed. I know a lot of people are going to give me crap for that, about the knockbacks and stuff like that. And yes, if you had crap internet, then sure, it would really make avoiding those knockbacks really difficult. But if you could do that, if you could avoid the knockbacks, I felt like this was just a really well-designed challenge, because of the fact that even if you had really, really good gear, you were still always at risk. You could always still fail. It wasn't just overload it with gear and just automatically win. You still had to pay attention to the mechanics and handle them. And a lot of people will say, well, this is just really a DPS race. But it's really a lot more than that, because of the fact that you are having to manage a stack of a debuff, you're having to gather adds together to cleave them down with a boss, and constantly be on the outlook for what is essentially environmental damage from the eyes and from the knockbacks of the infernals, as well as managing your health on top of that. And in the second phase, on top of all this, you have to have some sort of a defensive rotation to deal with the annihilates from Cruel. I think in terms of everything that you have to be looking out for in this challenge, it's a great challenge. Like, honestly, I really enjoyed it, all things considered. So for me, this was really the best one. Really, really enjoyed this one. I thought they did an excellent job on it, even with the knockbacks, even with the DPS race to some extent. That was always going to be part of it. You know, there was never going to be a time where your DPS wasn't going to matter for it. Maybe they could have made it a little bit more similar to the Proving Grounds, where you have someone doing most of the damage and your job is basically to only hold aggro. Sure, they could have gone that route, but they already had a challenge like that with the Proving Grounds. So I commend them for going the direction that they did, where it feels like you were the one to actually overcome the challenge by yourself. And it also allows it so, I really think that they really wanted these to be done in a way where it did get easier the later you were in the expansion. So having it to be a, quote, DPS race actually turned out to be a nerf the later you went into the expansion with the more gear that you had. So that's, yeah, to me, this one was perfect for me personally. I really enjoyed it. So that's kind of how I thought about the challenges individually. Overall, I thought they were great. I had a lot of fun with these. I spent over 10 months pretty much working my way through all of them, leveling up characters. I didn't even have, I think, 3 or 4 of the characters anywhere close to 110 when I started doing these, and I basically had to start those guys from scratch and work them up and then get them geared as well, and then also learn how to play them. I had never played a hunter, a rogue, or a priest before these challenges. Like, honestly, those were classes I'd just never been interested in, and these challenges found that interest for those classes. Like, honestly, my find out of those 3 classes, I found that Subtlety Rogue is extremely fun. I really, really like Subtlety Rogue, and I don't think I would ever have tried it without these Mage Towers. Same thing with like Discipline Priest. It's a lot more interesting than I thought it would be, even with the Legion rework with it. Really interesting idea. I don't think it's fully executed, despite how powerful they are like right now. But overall, yeah, I thought it was a great way for me anyway to be exposed to all of these other classes that I generally wouldn't play. So I think it worked for me on multiple levels. Not only was the challenge fun, but I also enjoyed playing some of these classes. So let's talk about how these challenges were really, really good. I think the best thing about them was how it allowed the specializations to bring out their uniqueness to these challenges. And what I mean by that is, like, let's just take Affliction Warlock's Burning Rush. If Karam had been running as fast as he did for the Affliction Warlock in the other classes that did the Twins challenge, no one else would have been able to do it. But because of the fact that Affliction Warlock has Burning Rush, it opens him up to a little bit more difficulty with having Karam run even faster, and can only be handled by Burning Rush. I actually really like that. I like that you basically have to play to the specialization instead of just looking at it from, here's the challenge, here are the classes that can do it, they can get in through the door, it's the exact same challenge. Instead, it's a little bit more tailored towards the Affliction Warlock for the Affliction Warlock when it does it, and the same thing would be said for like the Balance Druid. We'll just stay in the same challenge. The Balance Druid, he's running a lot slower because there's absolutely no way that the Balance Druid could contend with the speed of Karam if it was the same exact challenge that the Affliction Warlock had to deal with. So it kind of changed up how that you would approach it based on the specialization. You can't just look at one of these challenges and go, here's the guide for the Feral Druid. Agatha will be the same every single time for all the other classes as well. Not so at all. Like, I think the Fury Warrior had to deal with the largest health pool, and the Prot Paladin had the largest health pool on Cruel. So it took into account where your damage would be sitting, so you wouldn't just be, blasting your way through it and making it super easy for yourself. On top of that, going back to Prot Paladin has so many different ways to deal with Annihilate as opposed to the other tanks. It had more health, or Cruel had more health, for the sole purpose of you having to use more of those defensives. I think that was really the whole point of it. It was like, hey, you've got all these defensives, you have no reason why you can't survive a little bit longer than some of the other tanks, because this one really is just designed more towards that kind of playstyle, towards those more kind of like intermittent defensive abilities. So I really like the fact that these challenges were really different in the way that you would approach them, just depending on how whatever spec you were playing, as opposed to just here's the challenge and that's it. It was always a little bit different each time you did it, and for me that was just really cool. Obviously, I already talked about the fact that I really liked that there was 7 different ones. That was really awesome. And I just really like the fact that at the end of the day, you're getting a cool skin out of it. So all in all, as far as a challenge goes, I really liked it. I felt like it was pretty easy to find a good item level as well that would be challenging for you, as well as, still keeping it relevant as a challenge. So pretty much all things considered, these were really awesome. I really hope they do them again. However, I do want to point out a couple things that I would want different for the next time that they do this. First and foremost, can we just not have it on like a 3-day thing? Can we not have it like a 3-day and then 8 days off? Can we just have it up all the time? I think I understand why Blizzard did it this way. I think it completely comes down to the fact that Blizzard just doesn't trust us to not kill ourselves over it. I think that really comes down to that. I think they really wanted us to work on it a little bit and then go work on something else. I think they probably looked at Maw of Souls and how many people ran Maw of Souls endlessly in Mythic Plus just to grind out artifact power. And there were people out there who had, before Karazhan came out, so before, 7.1? Before even that happened, there were people that had over 1,000 dungeons of just Maw of Souls. That's just insane, and I think they were worried that would be the same kind of thing with the Mage Tower. Maybe not. Maybe they just wanted to kind of stretch out the content a little bit more, force you to focus on something other than just the Mage Tower instead of being able to do it all the time. I don't know. Personally, if people are going to do that, then they're going to do that in some way or another with something. If that's the kind of personality you have, just let us do it at any period of time. I can't tell you how many weekends or days that I just completely didn't get a chance to sit down and try even one because it just didn't line up with my schedule, because I've been super casual with this expansion and probably will be just because of my life in general. So not being able to just be like, hey, I'm going to go knock out a Mage Tower today was kind of crap, I would really have liked to have just been able to sit down and know that it was up. And honestly, that was really my biggest gripe about the whole thing, was just the accessibility. Sure, there's some other things we could bring up. We could talk about the fact that they weren't really balanced across the board, but in what world are they going to be able to balance all 36 classes to make them feel about the same difficulty? That was never going to happen. Even within each challenge, that's really asking a lot to try to say, let's try to make, the Outlaw Rogue as hard or as easy as, say, the Feral Druid. That's just not something that's going to be possible. That's so much little small tweaks and things like that for something that they still got really right, in my opinion. It was always doable. There was never one of them that you had to completely outgear. Like, sure, people will make arguments for like, oh, you needed to have Sacrilege for the Warlock if you wanted to keep it at like a reasonable difficulty. I'm like, well, yeah, it definitely made it easier, but you didn't need it. You didn't need to have loofahs. You didn't need to have any of the crazy legendaries that made these like pretty much broken. They definitely helped, and it was a nice little bonus, but you didn't need to have them. So the balancing issue to me really wasn't the big deal. I think a bigger deal, and this is a little bit more on like the personal side for me, is that they were, they didn't scale with gear, or they weren't locked to a certain gear level. That was one of my favorite things about the Proving Grounds when they first released back in Mists of Pandaria, was they wouldn't go above an item level of the heroic level gear for the dungeons, the dungeon heroics. That was the baseline gear, and everything got pushed down to that item level. So you could go in there with Siege of Orgrimmar mythic gear, and it would get pushed down an item level to be the same level as like a dungeon heroic. And I really liked that system because it kept it the same regardless of how geared you were, and everyone got the same exact challenge. I like that kind of a system. Maybe you don't. Maybe you like kind of like the soft nerf over time. That's fine. I personally tried to keep it somewhat challenging for myself. I would force myself to grind out gear that was worse for some of my characters. Like when it was released, my Warlock was actually really geared, and I actually had to go out to grind gear to make it easier to make it harder for like my Demonology Warlock, or for the Destruction Warlock. Like I took off legendaries to try to lower my item level to keep it at some sort of a challenge, just so I could get a better feel of how the challenge actually was. I had to do that with my Shaman as well for enhancement. I had to grind out some legendaries, and I specifically took off the Roots of Shaldrasil for both enhancement and for resto, because when I did it for elemental, I was like, oh my god, this is way too powerful of a legendary to be using for these challenges. I gotta take this off. So I didn't use it for those two. So basically, like, the fact that legendaries worked, the gear continued to make it easier to use. In my opinion, I would have loved to have something to make it more congruent across your gear, so you were always having at least somewhat close to the same challenge. But I understand that there's a certain side of things that's like, well, we want to keep this nerfed over time to allow as many people as possible to get them. And I get that. I totally get that. So that's more of a personal thing. It's not, I promise I'm not trying to make this like more of like an elitist thing. I'm not saying that less people should get it. That's not at all what I'm saying with that. I just wanted to keep it a little bit more of a challenge. I definitely think as many people as possible should get these. That's why I made guides. I was trying to help as much as possible. I don't want it to be a thing that's just super unique to only the select few. I don't care about that. I got mine. I don't care. I want as many other people to get it too, because that's fun for me. If I helped someone get an appearance, that's awesome. So that's not coming from an elitist standpoint. It's just coming from a conservation of challenge standpoint, if that makes any sense. So that's another point, take it or leave it. But overall, those are my main gripes with it. I don't think there was any one mechanic that just came out as like, this is a dumb mechanic, other than just, the worm one, Tugar, the Fell Totem one, not really having enough mechanics or enough impactful mechanics. The mechanics as a whole that were present, that were there, I thought were really well done, really good. Maybe another minor gripe would be the fact that there were little minor story elements tied to these. Mainly, the only one that I'm kind of sad for people who didn't get to do it would be the God Queen's Fury, because that's the only one that had somewhat of possible future lore implications. The other ones were kind of like, here's the thing, go kill it, which doesn't really matter. So those were fine, but the God Queen's Fury actually ended up being something that could be important later on down the line. Probably not the best to have in a limited time challenge. That was kind of a big problem with the legendaries in Pandaria, or the Mists of Pandaria, was there was a hell of a lot of story in getting the legendary cape, and you can just never do it anymore. All that story has just been taken out. It was really important, interesting story that was hinting at Legion as a whole, as an expansion. It hinted at that back in Mists of Pandaria. So that's really sad that we can't go back and look at those quest lines and stuff. So yeah, that's the only thing that I'm kind of upset about was the God Queen's Fury. You'll never get to see that now if you didn't do it. There's no way to go back and look at that, and that probably should have gotten left out too. That should have been just another normal quest line. But I have to say, overall, I thought these things were amazing. Blizzard, please make more of these. I really enjoyed them. But I want to know what you guys think. What did you like about the challenges? What did you not like about the challenges? What would you like to see changed and improved on in the future? And just in general, what you're hoping for in the future. I would love to get some sort of discussion going in the comments. So please let me know what you guys think. And until the next video, I will see you guys next time.